I call myself a psychedelic mentor and alchemy coach. So, very much bringing together my background in creative direction and storytelling with the work of psychedelics, the work of the soul, the story that each of us is living, that is living through us. So that is what I'm doing as a guide and a psychopomp and coach. And I am in a period of really diversifying what my work looks like and my offerings look like. So I'm sure we can get into that more as time continues. But also worth mentioning, I'm a wife, I am a mama, and a creative doula, I would say. I've always been a seeker, always been a seeker. And as a seeker, I am always someone who's had a natural proclivity to reinvention, to rebirth, and of course also to death, right? Because rebirth doesn't come without death. So that's just part of the fabric of who I am, my natural constitution. So as such, I've made many pivots throughout my life, particularly in the realm of my career. And then I would say, high level over 20 plus years, 25 years, really, it's been a series of initiations, many of which have involved plant medicine, of course, that have, carried me from the world of fashion and storytelling in more of a brand context to rebranding in an internal sense, right? And the storytelling of the soul. So the first of those initiations was when I started to work with psychedelics for the first time, which was I think around 17, I had my first mushroom journey. And, driven by what was certainly, pretty stereotypical teenage curiosity, what transpired was not any kind of escape, but rather the medicine taking me deeper and deeper and deeper into myself, right? My father had passed away very suddenly when I was about 10. So those first experiences with the medicine were so much about opening the floodgates of unmetabolized grief, connecting with the more than human world, connecting with exiled parts of myself, essentially. And of course, I didn't have that languaging at the time. And now I understand it, through this framework and language of parts. And then, throughout college, I continued to experiment, had some very formative experiences with acid and with MDMA. Another funny thing that happened in those years was that many of my peers, for whatever reason, and to this day, I may not know why or what inspired them to ask me to be their Sherpa or their guide for their first ever psychedelic experiences. So just kind of a funny foreshadowing of what was to come many years later. At that time, it was, far more about keeping them safe and making sure all their basic needs were met than it was about, kind of being, a guide or a psychopomp in the sense that I now embody that role. But nonetheless, just this, very cosmic foreshadowing of what was to come on my path many, many years later. I grew up in a culture where, it was like you were handed the playbook and you just kind of follow the rules, right? So I had, the privilege of going to a Quaker school for high school and then onto an Ivy League school. And, the cultural conditioning that I grew up in was very much happiness is about success and success is about accolade. So I did what everybody did and I went out and got myself a corporate job. That was its own initiation and one that I'm very grateful for. The first chunk of my career was spent doing strategy work and future forecasting work and also a lot of ethnographic research. So it was there that I really learned how to talk to people, how to understand what makes them tick. So I did that for a while and it was really fascinating work. It was so exciting. I had the good fortune of traveling all over the country and internationally. I lived in London for a little while working on a proprietary trends product that I was building. And it really taught me how to amalgamate a lot of disparate points of insight and information and create a story, create something cohesive, create a narrative. So that was a really big foundational piece to my work as a storyteller. And, being the seeker, there's this great David White line where he says, what is the image at the truth of the center you were born with? And for me, it's like the Ouroboros. It's like the serpent eating its tail. So, in true Ouroboros fashion, I was like, okay, this has been great, but like, what's next? What's next? And it was at that point that I segued into styling, fashion styling, and prop styling, and that world of, photo art direction and building visual stories. So I worked for a number of American brands, Old Navy and Banana Republic and Levi's. And it was at that time when I started to really hear that voice, the voice of the soul. And the volume would go up and down over the years, but the message was the same. And the voice was saying, girl, this isn't it. This isn't it. And, I'll be honest, I compartmentalized that voice for many years. I just wasn't fully ready. And, I will say as well that over the years, I continued to experiment with psychedelics. I continued to work with medicine. And there were even messages that were coming through, really reinforcing that voice and opening, let's say, new pockets of resonance with that voice. But I just wasn't quite ready. I wasn't quite ready to heed these messages and really engage seriously in an inquiry around, okay, well, if not this, then what? Right. But it was always there. And I would say the next very big initiation for me happened, I was 31, and I decided with my boyfriend at the time to embark on a round the world trip. So we had been living in San Francisco, and we had some European friends come and visit us in San Francisco on their quote world trip. And I was like, a world trip? Like, what do you mean? Like, what's that? And they were like, yeah, we're just taking a year to travel around the world. And I was like, what? That's a thing? You can do that? I want to do that. So it was a couple of years of saving money and, really kind of formulating the plan. And then we embarked. So we quit our jobs and sold our things. And it was a real shedding. And we spent a full year traveling around the world, mostly together, but we also traveled separately for many of those intervals. And I believe I spent time in 28 or 29 countries. Yeah, it was such an incredible gift and, privilege to be able to embark on a journey like that. And, it was deeply challenging as well in many ways, practically speaking, just living out of a backpack for a year, but really on a spiritual level, just, meeting new edges of myself and my shadows, my insecurities. And it was actually on that trip that I first sat with ayahuasca towards the beginning of that trip. What a transformative experience that was, and just it was like a complete shakeup of all my narratives of who I am and who I'm not, and my cosmic blueprint, if you will. And so much opened for me through the portal of that experience. And then I had, the better part of the rest of the year to sit with it and to really kind of marinate in it. So that was a very pivotal experience for me that allowed me to really meet. I mean, it was some really intense shadow work. It just really allowed me to view my life and my set of circumstances and my family of origin through a completely new lens. And then, of course, what did I do on the back end? I did not do what spirit and my soul was asking me. And I moved back to New York and re-entered the hustle. It was very hard on the soul. And needless to say, it didn't flow quite the way I hoped it would. And I was just fundamentally different at that point, having had this experience of traveling around, seeing so many other versions of happiness and fulfillment and family and creativity and possibility. And of course, poverty as well. And, I was just different. And try as I did to form myself into the version of adulthood and of career that our culture really celebrates. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I did it for a few years, and then things really shifted for me when the pandemic began. I was at the time working for a very successful startup in a creative director position. I was helming a team, and, it was high pressure, high stakes, living in New York City. And I was about 6 months pregnant when the pandemic started. What ended up happening was, gosh, yet another very, very profound initiation, which for me coincided with an initiation into motherhood. And essentially, what happened was I went into labor on June 1st, 2020, which, as you remember, was the time when COVID was just raging and New York being sort of ground zero of COVID. And June 1st was also the day that the George Floyd protests erupted at City Hall. Yeah, he'd been murdered that prior weekend. So there I was delivering, like in labor with this baby, my first and only baby on the ground floor of Weill Cornell Hospital, right there at City Hall. And, COVID is raging inside these four walls and the people are raging outside these walls. And I'm like, why is this happening? And why am I here? And what is this moment about? And why am I birthing this baby in this moment? And all these really big existential and ontological questions. And as my son was passing through the birth canal, I had a vision and a very sentient somatic experience to go with it of passing through my own birth canal. And it linked with a journey that I'd had with mushrooms many years prior. It was like deja vu times infinity, if you can imagine. And it was like all timelines collapsed. And that particular journey and that particular moment of birthing my son it was about rebirth. And it was like direct communion with spirit. And the message was so clear. And it was like, you know exactly why you're here. You know exactly what it is you're here to do as your earth assignment and your soul assignment. You are a healer. And it's time to step onto that path. It's time to step on. And I could not unsee what I'd seen or unhear what I'd heard or unfeel what I felt in that moment. So that was like kind of the final threshold that pushed me across, out of this sort of corporate identity and into more of a betwixt and between soul identity, really. So essentially at that point, I knew my path was going to be with medicine. I had, been journeying at that point for, around 20 years. And some of my most, formative and catalytic experiences in this lifetime had been with medicine. And I just knew in my bones that that was it. So I then had to figure out, okay, well, like, how am I going to, I know what the path is, but how am I going to step onto it? So it was really about finding my tribe and figuring out, what would be the way and the environment where I wanted to train formally. And, I did go back from my maternity leave and kind of tied up all my loose ends, moved from New York back to Philly, and I enrolled in the Psychedelic Coaching Institute, their practitioner training program. Yeah, and I was part of the second cohort. So that really set me on this path. Of course, I've done, a lot of other training as well. So I knew for sure that I wanted to get trained in parts work because it's just such a beautiful, beautiful complement to the world and the work of psychedelics. I imagine maybe some of your listeners are familiar with internal family systems, which is probably the best known modality of parts work. But the idea is essentially that we are all a symphony of different selves, right? It transcends just aspects of our personality. It's like we have different beings, different selves, different identities that are within us. And by the time we get into adulthood, so many of these parts and selves have been compartmentalized. They've sort of been forgotten, and we become very reliant and identified with those parts of ourselves that have been successful for us, and that have been reinforced by our cultural conditioning, by our familial conditioning, by the zeitgeist as well. And the idea of parts work is to really bring from the unconscious into the consciousness these lost and forgotten parts of ourselves, most often anchored in childhood, right? Connected deeply and intimately to our inner children. So that's sort of the general premise of parts work, with the goal to bring harmony to our parts. Like how often are we in a situation? It could be something so small where we're like, oh, part of me wants to go and part of me just wants to stay home. And there's this sort of like war of attrition between our parts, right? So the idea of parts work is to really bring harmony to our parts so they can coexist and they can work together versus sort of battle with one another, if you will. And, in a psychedelic experience, that often happens very organically, right? So that can look a lot of different ways, but we might have an experience with MDMA where that inner 8-year-old comes to the fore and just needs to be witnessed, needs to be held, needs their experience to be known and understood, and needs to receive that love and nurturing, not just from our space holder, but really from our higher self, from our wise adult self, right? Or there may be a scenario, this has happened to me, I had a mushroom journey where the artist within me really came forward and was like, I need to be creating. And she was rageful, she was like Kali, and, she was, yeah, she wanted to be let out. She wanted to be liberated, right? So the language of parts and the framework of parts is just such a helpful scaffolding, let's say, for understanding and making meaning from our psychedelic experiences. And to your point, having some ground to stand on as far as integrating them and anchoring them and understanding, okay, like what wants to emerge, what new ritual or what new expression wants to come forward out of me, I heard someone say recently, it's our parents are the instruments of our creation, they are our biological creators, but we are our own parents. To your point, that's very much what we're here to do, is reparent ourselves, and heal those moments, those wounds, those aspects of our life and our path where we took on stories that aren't true or conditioning that held us back, to really remind ourselves of all the possibility. I spent quite a bit of time training, and from there my practice was born. It was very natural. My practice is called Kaleidoscope Eye, which is a little ode to the Beatles, but also very much, a reflection of our kaleidoscopic nature, right? The sort of infinite facets of each of us. Again, that we are these limitless beings, that there exists all of this sort of infinite possibility for our lives and within us as a reflection of divine source. Essentially, I had already been guiding others in medicine experiences and holding space for them to make meaning. What blossomed was essentially a more formal practice around guiding others and holding them through the arc of transformation. I tend to work in longer containers with folks. So, of course, before a journey, it's just so important to build that trust and rapport, right? If someone feels understood, if someone feels fully safe, they can just go that much deeper in a journey experience, right? It just makes sense. But not only that, I find the prep before a journey is such a ripe time to bring in parts work. I've studied IFS, but the other modality that I'm trained in is called inner team dialogue. And it's adjacent to IFS. I would say it's distinct in some ways. It's a little bit more whimsical. It's kind of fun. It's sort of like puts aside the taxonomy of IFS, which is about managers and firefighters and exiles, and just gets right into naming the parts and kind of giving them personalities and imagining how they look and how they dress and how they hold their body and giving them names and all this kind of stuff. So I find it's such a fun, generative, inspiring tool to bring into the prep stage of things because it essentially gives people a little bit of like a map of their psyche, if you will, right? Or another metaphor could be like the cast of characters, right? That are living out the play of their life, right? So who's on stage, who's off stage and ready to come on stage. So that's very, very powerful in the prep stage of things. And then yes, I will, kind of design a journey for someone just based on their unique needs, their background, their intentions, whatever they may be navigating in their life or in their body, any medications they're on. First and foremost, of course, is keeping people safe. Sometimes it's a series of journeys. I do, hold space for folks in journey space. So that's something most often folks will do with me. And so it's about determining, which medicine and or combinations of medicines. It really looks different for everybody in terms of that the actual experience. I mean, there I certainly do. I certainly want to make sure that there is neutrality, right? I'm not here to influence or steer someone's experience. I'm not here to bring any agenda of any kind. I'm here to open spaciousness for whatever it is that wants to emerge, whatever wants to come forth from their heart, from their soul, from their mind, from their body, and so on. But I will say I tend to take a more active role. There's different philosophies and schools of thought around how to hold space as a facilitator. I gravitate more to an active role wherein if there's, a doorway that's opening, so to speak, I like to grab the person's hand and, really escort them through it with compassion and attunement. And I take copious notes. So again, it all looks very different person to person and experience to experience. And then on the back end, that's the integration, I really believe, is the medicine, right? It's like the journey opens a gateway and the integration is where the rubber meets the road and where the work of change and expansion and transformation really happens. So I tend to work with people for a quite extended period, I would say, often over many months, or even I have, quite a few folks that I've been working with for years now to continue deepening and expanding into the integration process. It's often, the integration with folks. And, this is the word integration has become such a buzzword in this space. And it's like, well, what does that really mean? And for me, it's really person to person, Michelle, right? I mean, I think there are some foundational aspects of integration, right? So it's like walking our talk, meaning what we say, saying what we meaning what we say and doing what we say. What's the expression? Saying what we mean and meaning what we say. And person to person, it really differs. I think integration is a lot about honesty, right? Like being really, really honest about where we're out of alignment in our life. And that can be across so many different aspects of life, and our relationships, in our work life, in how we honor and care for our bodies and so on. I often like to say that integration, it's not about doing more. I feel like sometimes it's like people ascribe integration to this sort of like a to-do list, like, okay, I gotta make this change and do that and be more active in this way. And actually, I think the work of integration is often about doing less. It's about being more and doing less. I can say for me personally, that's definitely been the case. Learning how to slow down, learning how to stay in attunement, learning how to stay in our bodies, which is definitely still a growth edge for me personally. And, I guess the last piece I'll say on integration is, there are some practices that across the board, I always encourage and invite the celebrants that I'm working with. That's the word I like to use instead of clients, which feels very hierarchical to me. It's nice, right? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I learned that from a friend and a mentor of mine who uses that word. And I was like, yes, that really resonates. That fits. One of the practices I always encourage and invite folks to step into is prayer. Just the power of prayer and connecting intentionally with source and spirit, and we all have different ways we conceive of that or different words that resonate. But just that sacred pause to really honor our hearts and connect with the more than human realm. And, that doesn't have to be a practice that takes a really long time, but nonetheless is just so, so powerful in continuing to fortify our trust in the unfolding of things, the divine mystery of it all. Because I tend to work with a lot of folks who are in some kind of threshold or big transitional moment in their life. Maybe they're navigating grief, maybe they're navigating porous boundaries and this sort of edge or threshold they're crossing where they're like, I can't do it anymore. Or it could be creative blockage, or it could be just an overall feeling of spiritual hunger, which is something that you and I alluded to earlier, of just sort of that feeling of going through the motions, living in a day to day where on paper everything checks out, but there's just this feeling, this missing or longing for deeper soul, for deeper substance and meaning in what we're doing with our days, with our time, with our gifts. So I find that prayer can be so supportive across the board, even though everybody's integration recipe, so to speak, is comprised of different ingredients. That's one of the key ingredients. I myself am in a stage of rebirth and expansion, and part of what that looks like for me is creativity, creating and amplifying my voice and my impact in this space, and really showing up, really fully showing up and putting myself out there. One of the first intentions or initiations on that path was actually creating a podcast. It was something I had always dreamed of and really wanted to do. And there were a lot of limiting beliefs coming up around that. And, oh, does the world need yet another podcast? Does the world need my voice? And it's like, yes, the world does need my voice. I have a podcast which I co-host with a dear psychedelic soul sister who is also a couples therapist named Lily Eggers. And our pod is called In Right Relationship. We bring on all sorts of interesting thought leaders in this space, from curanderas to researchers to, everywhere in between. We try to really feature a lot of different voices in this space from different angles and perspectives. And we focus a lot on integration, and what that means, because there really is no one size fits all version of that. And it can look so many different ways. There's so many different modalities that can also support us in whatever we are integrating and whatever we are anchoring. Our culture really promotes this narrative of the quick fix, right? Or this maybe a fallacy of the quick fix. We are total experience junkies as well, right? And that is a facet of living in this capitalist landscape that really permeates every aspect of our lives, like it or not, agree or not, it's the water we swim in, right? So even if we are not people who are wrapped up in material consumption, there's this other dynamic of experience consumption that is so rampant in our culture of more, bigger, 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 bigger. And we're obsessed with novelty. Right. And I've been there myself in, previous phases of my life where it was like wanting to constantly have these novelty experiences. One, because of the adrenaline and the excitement and the seeking, and two, because there's a certain, let's say, social currency or social cachet that is wrapped up in people, having these stories to tell about these big breakthrough experiences, right? But there truly is no point in having medicine experience after medicine experience after medicine experience if at the end of the day, nothing is really changing, right? If you're still experiencing anxiety, if you're still feeling limited by certain stories or beliefs that are operating as a script inside your mind, if you are still feeling resentment towards your parents, if you are still finding the same patterns are occurring in your relationships, it's like, what's the point of the big breakthrough experience if nothing is actually shifting and evolving and growing and blossoming in your life? So I think it's really a lot of that cultural conditioning that we're up against, is that, kind of silver bullet mentality and our obsession with convenience and our obsession with quickness, and instant gratification. And so part of our work collectively is to really rewire some of those tendencies, because they're rampant. So I'm actually just about to launch, and by the time this podcast goes live, I will have launched my new group program, which I'd love to share with you all. It's called The Oracle Within, a mythopoetic explorer's studio. And essentially, The Oracle Within is a 9-week group program into mythopoetic teachings and tools, all brought to life through a guided collage project and a soul-seeing writing practice that will unfold over the full arc of the time we're in the container. So essentially, there will be 7 live sessions via Zoom. So we'll bring together people from all over the country, all over the world. And each of these sessions is going to introduce a different mythopoetic theme. And when I say mythopoetic theme, essentially what I mean is different Jungian and shamanic ideas, particular mythic stories that are oriented around that specific theme, symbolic tools, and then guides the participants through those teachings in an experiential way wherein they're mapping onto the page of their collage. And then by the very end of the course, everybody's mythopoetic collage is going to transform into a personal oracle deck. I'm really excited about this offering because it feels really new and different. I think for me, creativity is how we metabolize our experience, right? I think so often in the realm of integration, we kind of bypass that stage. We go right into the cerebral meaning making, and we bypass this liminal, imaginal phase of art making and movement and, imagery and symbol. And a lot of times transformation and revelation lives in the body before we even have the words to articulate or contour it, right? So when we can create these opportunities to express from that liminal right brain place of just even understanding, oh yeah, that's an image I gravitate to. And we might not need to know why at the outset. There's a time and a place to make meaning and to dialogue with what is emerging through these images and symbols and textures and all these materials. So for me, collage is just such an ideal medium to play because it's accessible. It is, kind of making something from these disparate bits and bobs, right? Like much like a journey where we have this visual or this somatic experience or this message or this person comes to us. It's like this disparate, amalgam of all these different things. And so collage allows us to make something cohesive of that. And then when we dialogue with what is emerging, there are so many rich revelations that come to the fore. The Oracle Within is an offering that is aimed at other coaches, space holders, and therapists who are interested in learning new Jungian informed tools and techniques for self-insight and to bring into their work with clients and others. It could also be people who work in team settings at work and just want new tools to facilitate insight and evolution and development. It's also very much aimed at people who feel creatively stuck or stagnant in some way. You know, when we lead busy lives, one of the first things that gets cut from our lives is creative expression and play, right? Like those are the two things. And so this is an opportunity built into each session. There will be opportunities for that play, that art making, the collaging, the writing. It's all built in. So it gives people, you know, that scaffolding to stay accountable to a creative practice, and also kind of a gentle structure so that creativity can be freeing, it can be joyful, it can be fun, and sort of removed from a lot of the pressures that we sometimes feel to make something good, right? That's something I often hear from people when they're talking about their relationship to their creativity is there are shoulds, there are pressures, there's, you know, these sort of internal expectations of making something that is good, that is presentable. So this is an opportunity to really alchemize some of those patterns or those narratives and just play. You know, I think in large part the well-being of humanity going forward is a reclamation of play.